Hello and welcome to another episode of the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Juma Iraqi, and today I'm joined by Greg Nuckols from Stronger by Science. Greg, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast.
Pleasure.
We did a podcast last year on squats, about an hour or something like that, where we just talked about the exercise squats. But today we're going to talk about a different topic. We're going to talk about genetics, and I know that you've written a couple of articles on this topic that I will link in the description of this podcast. So before we start, I just want to mention that this podcast is available on YouTube in video format, but you can also listen to it on iTunes if you prefer that. So, Greg, for people that haven't watched our previous podcast, could you give us an introduction about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Greg. I lift weights. Sometimes I write about lifting weights, and I help other people get good at lifting weights, and that's about it. Beer, have a cute dog. That's about it.
That's about it. You're not going to mention any of your big lifts?
Nah, I mean, I figure by the end of the show, people can decide whether I'm someone worth taking seriously or not. Just let the information stand on its own.
Okay, sounds good. All right, Greg. So let's start by talking about, like, you often hear a claim that if you put in enough work and you work hard, and there's even been suggested as specific numbers for how many hours you need to achieve your sports performance goals. But is that true, or is it predetermined by your genetics?
Okay, so first things first, I think you're dealing with both nature and nurture here. And I think that a lot of people make this a more contentious subject than it needs to be, because they ask the question as if it's a dichotomy. So is it nature or is it nurture? And obviously it's both, right? So I think people who think that there's a strong genetic component still think nurture plays a role. I think there are some people, though, who think that, like, training and nurture and environment, that's all that matters. I think some of them do legitimately think genetics don't play a role. And those people are crazy. And hopefully the listeners will understand why by the end of this podcast. But yeah, they both play a role. So, you start at a given place, you respond to training in a given way, but you do still have to train, right? So it's not just your genetics determine how good you're going to be independent of training. You still have to train. That still absolutely makes a difference. But your genetics are definitely going to put some sort of cap on how good you can possibly get. I'm not necessarily sure it's a hard limit the way some people think it is. We're just, like, they use the term, like, your genetic ceiling, where, you get there and there's no possible way you can go past it. I think it's more of like an asymptote, tracking along a line that has just a very, very small positive trend until you basically get too old, and then has a shallow negative trend. But yeah, your genetics are largely what's going to, like, circumscribe that upper bound. And I think people just get weird ideas when they're dealing with a subject they're passionate about. So if I said something like, your genetics are largely going to constrain how good you can be at basketball, people would look out in the world and they'd be like, okay, I'm not Shaquille O'Neal. I'm not LeBron James. That makes sense. Like, they definitely picked better parents to do the whole basketball thing than I did. Yeah, of course, their genetics influenced how good they could be at basketball. They're bigger than me, they're stronger than me, they're faster than me, etc. And so like people see that, or let's say like smarts. They're like, oh, Stephen Hawking is like legitimately smarter than I am. It's not just like he trained harder to study physics harder, and like that's the only difference. He's just smarter than 99.9% of people on this planet. And so in subjects where people are relatively dispassionate about, they can recognize this. Then you drop them into a subject they are passionate about. So, for us, that's building strength, building muscle. People listening to this podcast, like that's a topic they're passionate about. And so it seems like once you have that emotional investment, for a lot of people, just reason goes out the window. And there are some people who kind of start getting this idea of like, oh no, like it's just about hard work. Like if I train hard enough, I can accomplish anything I want to. And that would be really cool if that was true, but it's kind of not. I mean, if you think you can just train hard enough to out squat Ray Williams, more power to you. And that might be a good thing to believe in the long run, because if you legitimately believe that, you will probably train harder and get better results because of it. But it's probably also an untrue belief. Okay, that was kind of the long rambling answer. The short, like more succinct answer is nature and nurture both definitely play roles. Your genetics play a role, how well you train, how long you train, how consistently you train. That definitely plays a role as well. And largely what your genetics do is kind of like circumscribe the range of results you can possibly get. So if you don't have great genes for lifting, training good and training hard and training smart will absolutely make you better. But that upper limit of how good you can get is going to be lower than someone who just picked better parents than you.
Excellent answer. Now, there's been a couple of claims as well that, like, say for example, you have the genetics.
Actually, if I can say one more thing about that as well.
Yeah.
There was actually a paper published this month, kind of testing the claim of it is just about putting in enough hours to get good. Mm-hmm. People kind of refer to the quote-unquote 10,000 hour rule. But the 10,000 hour rule was not, one, it's bad science, but that's another rant for another day. But it also wasn't based on athletics. So this new paper that was just published showed essentially that the more a sport was just based on raw athleticism, like, raw strength, raw power, raw force output, etc., the quicker people reached world-class levels in it, if they were going to reach world-class levels, versus ones that required like more like skill and coordination and finesse, took more hours to achieve like world-class status. So for example, I should have reviewed this paper before we got on this call, but I want to say they looked at things like sprinting and like shot put and stuff like that, like things where there is still definitely like a technical skill component, like sprint techniques important, shot put techniques obviously very important, but they're not just incredibly complex motor skills, and it's more just based on how explosive are you, how strong are you. The top achievers in those realms tended to get there after, I want to say it was like 2,000 to 4,000 hours of practice, which if you're training for like 3-4 hours a week, you're looking at, what is that, maybe like 3 to 5 years. That's the people who were going to be the best in the world were the best in the world after that amount of training. Versus, I want to say gymnastics was the one that they found required the most practice before people were world class in it. And I want to say that was that wasn't even 10,000 hours. I want to say the average there was like 8 to 9,000 hours. But yeah, so germane to our purposes here, powerlifting is, that's the purest test of strength that there is in terms of a sport. So yeah, like you can definitely keep improving after you've been training for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. I mean, I still am. Plenty of good lifters are still improving past that point. But if you've been training hard and you're not pretty damn good when you've put 3 or 4 years into it, you're probably never going to be all that good, which I guess is kind of a depressing way to look at it, but whatever. I'm just being honest.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. I actually remember we had, like, I was in the army, Norwegian army 10 years ago, and we had this guy. He was like, he wasn't huge, but he was really well trained, like had a lot of muscle and did about, I think it was 140, 150 kilograms in the bench, but he had trained like systematically for 4 or 5 years, I think. But then at the end of the year when we were in the army, I think it was the last 2 months, we had this guy that never lifted a weight in his whole life, came into the gym, and he was introduced to the weights by this guy. And he just, like, in a couple of weeks, he just went from, he started, like, the first time he even did a bench, he did 115 kilograms, and by the end of 2 months, he was doing the same weight as the other guy. He was doing reps for 140. I think he maxed out on 150, but that was just, like, it was insane to see a person with that type of genetics that could just walk in, and 2 months later, he was doing 150 kilograms in the bench. But I don't think he, like, here's the issue when we're talking about this topic. He didn't really have the same passion for training as the other guy. So, like, a year after that, when I spoke to him, he wasn't really doing anything anymore. And it's a shame when you have those sort of genetics that you actually don't use it for something that you could potentially be real good at. But I can imagine the frustration for the other guy, seeing a person just blow past him in a fraction of the time when he's put in so much work into it. Yeah,
it's I would imagine that would be pretty disheartening.
Yeah,
I was that second guy you were talking about growing up.
Yeah.
The first time, so, like, my parents got me like a dinky little weight set when I was like 10 or 11 years old, but I didn't really use it all that much. I did do deadlifts because I thought they were fun, but didn't really do very much with it. The first time I actually got my hands on like a full size like Olympic set of plates. The first time I benched 275, so 125 kilos, and also this was the first time that I actually been able to deadlift on like a good bar with full size plates. The bar I had either like 200 or 250 pounds. So I would just mess around with that weight because that's all I had. The first time I actually like got a full size bar and could max with it, I pulled, try to do this in kilos, like 185, 190. And I was like 14 years old and 65, 70 kilos at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then like 9 months later, I totaled, close to 700 kilos. And, it's just like a fifth, or no, that was a little over a year later. So, I had just turned 16 and I'd gone from like 65, 70 kilos to 95 kilos in that span of time. I just took to the weights and blew up and got good at lifting pretty quick. And that's Actually, so that's another important distinction to make as well. A lot of people, when they're assessing for themselves how much potential they have, they kind of take their starting point as an indicator. But there's actually a pretty fair amount of research showing that your starting point is not an indicator at all of how gifted you are for getting big and strong. There's essentially like no correlation between starting point and how well you respond to training. So you see this like in the fitness industry a lot. People have these like before and afters like of themselves when they got into lifting is like inspiration. It's like, oh, look, I was small and skinny. I have terrible genetics, but I still built a great body, or I still got really strong. That's just bullshit. Like, that's not, I see why people think that. And if they haven't looked at the research on it, I don't think I think they actually believe that when they say it. Like, I don't think they're lying. I think they're just mistaken. But yeah, it's complete bullshit. There's absolutely no correlation between how strong you are and how much muscle mass you have pre-training and how well you then go on to respond to training.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that dude you were talking about in the Norwegian army and me both. Like I was strong to start with and I responded to training well. But there are definitely people who start off like stronger than average and with more muscle mass than average who don't respond to training all that well. And then take someone like Lane Norton, who was like super skinny and weak when he started training, but like he's obviously responded to training super well. So yeah, it can work either way. And so for people listening to this, that's an idea to get out of your head. If you have like self-limiting beliefs because like you were small and weak when you first started training, don't think that that's any sort of indicator of where you're going to end up.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And like when we're on the subject as well, when like you often hear the claims that if you have been training for 5, 6, 7 years, your potential to grow new muscle or to increase your strength is greatly reduced. But I think it's just stupid to ask people how long have you been training, because there's people at the gym that's been there for 10 years, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've trained in a productive way, because there's a lot of people that... So I personally, when I assess new clients, I don't usually ask them how long they have been training, because it doesn't really give me an indication of how advanced they are. I would much rather have like pictures to look at muscularity and to look at their strength levels, because that's a better indicator of how advanced they are. Because like I said, you can ask people that are regulars at the gym and they say I've been training here for 12 years, but they don't even look like they lift.
Yeah.
So
yeah, like time spent training I think is a good indicator, but like it's time spent training well and time spent training hard.
Yeah.
You can take someone who's been in the gym for a decade, who's been training like an idiot, and put them on a good program and get them to train hard, and they make great results. That's actually, so I write about research a lot, and that's actually kind of a bit of pushback that I get pretty frequently, where, you know, there will be a study on trained lifters who, like, inclusion criteria says like, oh, these people have been training for at least 3 years or something like that. And let's say over the course of a 8-week study, they put 40 or 50 kilos on their squat on average. And people will be like, this is bullshit. There's no way that trained lifters can, you know, add that much to their squat in this period of time. And I'm like, the inclusion criteria only says like they've been lifting weights for 3 years. Like, look around the gym you train at. How many people who've been lifting weights for 3 years would you personally classify as well trained? Mm-hmm. It's not many. So yeah, like definitely, I think, yeah, that is kind of one drawback as well when you're talking about like applying research to the real world, just because like a study's like inclusion criteria for well-trained and like mine and yours idea of someone who's actually well-trained are probably going to be two relatively different things. And I would say that kind of on average, if someone's been training hard and training well for 5 to 7 years, they probably do still have some potential to keep improving and keep getting stronger. And if you're David Ricks, if you've been training 40 years, you're still improving and getting stronger. But yeah, I'd say on average, 5 to 7 years, you've done about as good as you're going to do. You might still have like maybe another 5% or something to gain, but things are going to be pretty slow at that point. But if you've just been dicking around for 5 to 7 years, you're still essentially a new lifter. And if anything, you might be able to gain muscle and strength faster than someone who's still relatively new to it, because like you have decent technique at that point. So you can train harder if you decided to pull your head out of your ass and actually start lifting hard.
Yeah, excellent. But how can there be such a big difference in genetics between people when 99.9 of our genes are the same?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that, because that is people who say that genetics don't matter for strength development or hypertrophy. That tends to be one of the first things they throw out, like, oh, we're 99.9% genetically similar, so there can't be this degree of variability. So when people ask that, I think it shows a lack of understanding about how genetics work in the first place. So we do share 99.9% of the same genes. So first, what a gene is. It's a sequence of DNA nucleotides that codes for a given protein. And that's all it is. But there are like different. How technically savvy do you think your audience is about genetics already?
I think you should explain it quite easy. Okay,
that's fine. Mm-hmm. So first things first, there are different versions of the same gene. So for example, there's a gene called ACTN3, and that codes for a binding protein that just kind of in layman's terms, it makes your fast twitch muscle fibers capable of twitching fast. So without this protein, type 2 fibers behave much more similarly to type 1 fibers, but still with crappy endurance. So makes your type 2 fibers just really not good for all that much. And they find that, kind of unsurprisingly, world-class sprinters tend to have, there's a good version and a bad version of this gene, at least for strength and power athletes. So there's a version of the gene that codes for this protein that you want, and there's a version of the gene that still codes for a protein, but it doesn't function properly. And generally, good strength and power athletes have the proper functioning version of the ACTN3 gene. And so that's something that does influence performance, absolutely. But people with the good and bad version of the gene, they still have the same gene. So when you're counting that 99.9% genetic similarity, that would be counted as a similarity. They have the same gene, but it's different versions of the same gene. So that's one thing that helps explain it. Another thing is copy number variation. So you probably learned in school that you have 2 copies of every gene. So you have 2 chromosomes, and you have like 1 version of each gene on like corresponding chromosomes. And that is not entirely true. You can actually have like different numbers of the same gene. And so a good example of this, I'm not directly sure, or I don't directly know any examples that are directly relevant to strength and hypertrophy, but there is one that's relevant to body composition. study published in Nature, I believe, in 2015 was looking at the copy number variation of the salivary amylase gene. So salivary amylase is an enzyme in your mouth that starts breaking down carbohydrate while you're still chewing it, before you swallow it, before it goes through your digestive system. And essentially, it starts breaking down starch into sugar, and that does two things. One, for a finite level of carbohydrate consumption, it tastes sweeter and gives you more of a quote unquote reward response. And it also causes a larger what's called cephalic phase insulin response, where while the food's still in your mouth, your body starts producing insulin because it knows that carbohydrate is going to be coming into your blood soon. So it gets ready to dispose of that in the cells. So those are two good things. And they found that people with higher copy number variation of the salivary amylase gene had more salivary amylase in their mouth. And so they had the larger cephalic phase insulin response. I want to say they looked at dopamine signaling pathways in the brain or whatever. But most importantly, they looked to see how that correlated with BMI. And they found that people with the highest copy number variation of this gene had the lowest BMIs, and the people with the lowest copy number variation, producing less salivary amylase, had the higher BMIs. Because essentially, the people with more copies of this gene, their body was more primed to handle the carbohydrate they ate. They also got a larger reward response from a given level of carbohydrate intake, so they didn't need to eat as much of it to get the same feeling of reward and gratification. So yeah, copy number variation is another example of all of those people have the same gene that counts in the 99.9% genetic similarity, but you can still have differing outcomes resulting from that. Let's see. Another good example is post-translational modification. So essentially, your genes code for RNA, and your RNA is translated into proteins. And the protein is ultimately what matters. That's what has some sort of functional effect inside your body. But different proteins obviously have different effects. And so what post-translational modification is essentially your genes might code for a given protein, but then once that protein is in your cells, in your body, etc., it can be changed into a slightly different form of that protein, which may have larger effects, smaller effects, or just plain different effects. So a good example of this is IGF-1 has some anabolic signaling properties. Systemic IGF-1 probably doesn't have all that much of an effect for muscle growth, but intracellular IGF-1, so what's called autocrine and paracrine signaling of IGF-1, so your muscles produce it themselves, and that IGF-1 that's already there in your muscles probably does play a pretty meaningful role with post-exercise regeneration and remodeling of muscle tissue. But IGF-1 itself doesn't do all that much, but it has what are called splice variants of IGF-1 that are much more bioactive, and high responders to exercise. Essentially, their body, once the DNA's part of it is taken care of, once IGF-1 has been produced, some people modify that into the more bioactive forms of it more efficiently. So again, everyone has the same IGF-1 gene, but some people, their body is capable of converting that to the quote-unquote better forms of IGF-1, at least as far as hypertrophy goes. And then obviously the last big example would be how well a gene is expressed, so epigenetics. So essentially, you can have the same genes, but some people express those genes better than other people do. So just because you have a gene doesn't necessarily mean your body is going to read it and produce the proteins that it codes for. And there's no guarantee that two people are going to express their genes equally well. So yeah, that's the last example. Like you can have the same genes, but let's say that you have a gene that codes for some sort of anabolic signaling molecule. Let's say mTOR or something like that. I don't know. Some people, or let's just say ribosomes, the things that actually produce the protein. The DNA that codes for ribosomes, some people may express those genes a lot. Some people may not express them all that much. So again, they have the same genes, but they have different functional outcomes just due to how well or how poorly the genes are expressed. So yeah, there's, and I think just in terms of like the layman's explanation of this, if you're walking down the street, you're seeing a ton of people, seeing some big people, some little people, some fat people, some thin people, some smart people, some super dumb people. All those people are 99.9% genetically similar. But I think in terms of functional outcomes, I think you would agree that there's more than a 0.1% difference between all of those people. And like we share 92% of our genes with mice. I think most of us would agree in terms of functional outcomes, we're more than 8% different from mice. So yeah, 0.1% difference, but that 0.1% and all of kind of the caveats around the intricacies of genetics can make that 0.1% difference pretty big.
Excellent. That was a great explanation. Now we talked a lot about the super genetic guys, for example, yourself and your strength level, and the guy that I talked about in the army. But there seems to be some people that are categorized as non-responders. Could you explain a bit about that and how much, like percentage-wise, how much people does get affected from this?
Yeah, so that's kind of the dark side of genetics and strength training. You're right. There are outliers on both ends of the spectrum, and we tend to focus on the outliers on the kind of top end of the spectrum and not the bottom end. But yeah, in research looking at how well people respond to training that actually like plots individual responses, they tend to see a non-negligible amount of people, even completely untrained people. They take up strength training for the first time. Almost everyone gets stronger. You might see one or two stragglers in a study that don't get stronger, but almost everyone gets stronger. But something like, depending what study you look at, between maybe like 5 and 20% of the participants, completely untrained, take up strength training for the first time, don't build any muscle whatsoever. And in some cases actually lose muscle, which like, that's super depressing. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, researchers use the term non-responders, and I think that term might be appropriate in the context of a single study, but I think kind of lay audiences reading that term, they tend to generalize it more than they should. So if someone in a study doesn't respond to the training protocol they were put on, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't respond to strength training, period. It might just mean that they didn't respond to the training protocol used in the study. So, I mean, like, you know, I'm not untrained, obviously, but if you took me and put me on like a study protocol that, you know, maybe it's 3 sets of 10 reps once a week for some exercise I already do all the time, I'm not going to get stronger from that. I'm not going to build muscle from that. I'm not going to have any beneficial outcomes from that. So I would be classified in that study as a non-responder. Like, obviously I'm not a non-responder. So that is something to keep in mind. All it says is that percentage of people didn't respond to the training protocol used in the study. So one thing potentially is, you know, if they tried another training program, maybe they'd get better results. Obviously, you can't control every variable in a study, so maybe those people weren't sleeping well, weren't eating enough, something like that. But I do think I do think a non-responder in this study probably does kind of innately have a smaller response to training than someone in the study who responds better. But it's hard to know exactly what percentage of the population is what I would term a true non-responder. So they literally cannot build muscle in response to training. I do think those people are out there. I've worked with a lot of people, and I think I've come across like 2 legit non-responders. One of them, teenage kid, and like his mom wanted him to lift weights because like he was getting bullied a lot. I think for him, it may have been kind of an issue of like sabotaging himself outside the gym, because his mom was making him do it. He wasn't super invested in the process. So for him, I'm really not sure. I do know I worked with this guy for like 9 months, super scrawny kid, and like we tried everything, and he didn't build an ounce of muscle. Another dude though, he was like 18, 19, like a good age to build a lot of muscle, and he was like super gung-ho about it. Like he was this poor kid. He saw pumping iron, and he was that case. He saw pumping iron, and he's like, I want to be Arnold. And so like for like 6 months, this dude was like super gung-ho about it. Like I know he was sleeping enough. Like I know he was like eating plenty of food generally and plenty of protein. Like he was just coming in and attacking his workouts. 2 months in, he doesn't really have much to show for it. So like we make some adjustments to his program. Another 2 months go by, still doesn't have anything to show for it. Make some more changes to his program. Like I know it wasn't just like a training style thing for him. Like I ran him through like 3 like pretty dissimilar programs just to see if it was a matter of not responding to the type of training I put him on initially. And again, another 2 months go by, 6 months in at this point, dude looks identical to how he did when he walked in the gym the first time. All of his measurements are the same, weighs the same. His lifts have maybe gone up 5%. Like that dude was a non-responder. Like I know that he was taking care of business outside the gym, and I know how to get people bigger and stronger. Like I have a very high success rate with that. But yeah, this dude just didn't respond to anything. So like there are people like that out there, but at the same time, studies tend to show non-response rates of 5 to 20% or so. I think true non-response rate is dramatically lower than that. If you take a competent trainer, give them a bunch of people to train, the 20% is super high, obviously. Like you're going to get results in more than 4 out of 5 people. And if you're training completely untrained people, I think even the 5% is too high. Like that's 1 in 20 people just not responding. I've trained a lot of completely untrained people, and out of several hundred, I've had 2 that I think might be non-responders, and one of them I think it is probably more on him than me. So out of several hundred, like 1 who really didn't get anything out of training, who I really think was taking care of business on his own time. So yeah, I definitely believe those people are out there, but I think they're relatively rare.
Excellent. Now, I tend to doesn't matter what topic we're talking about, it always tend to come up like a musclehead question. So I thought we could talk a bit about myostatin and muscle growth. And while we're on the topic, could you also just mention like how much muscle is? Like we can talk about how much muscle mass you can expect to build in the first year and progressively after that on average. If we can touch about just to show some numbers.
Yeah. So just based on what I've seen, people tend to build somewhere between kind of on the low end 10-ish kilos of muscle, and on the high end, 20-ish kilos of muscle across a training career. And I think it follows like kind of a exponential decay pattern where what you're going to gain, generally you get about half of that in the first year, and then what you have left, you get about half of that in the second year. What you have left, you get about half of that in the third year. So if you're going to gain 10 kilos of muscle across a training career, probably going to gain about 5 in the first year, 2.5 in the second year, 1.5 in the third year, and then pretty slow from there on in.
So how slow are we talking about at the end? We're talking about like 0.1, 0.2 kilograms a year?
Yeah. Pretty much.
Yeah.
And I mean, like if you look at like drug-free natural bodybuilders, well, okay, that's redundant. If you look at natural bodybuilders who've been doing it for 10 plus years, like a lot of them, their stage weights are literally identical show to show. Like, yeah, things slow to a crawl eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what's the relationship between muscle growth and myostatin?
So from what I've seen, myostatin is very similar to testosterone, in that with testosterone, within the normal physiological range, doesn't really matter where you fall. It might be 400, might be 900, kind of on average, as long as you're within the normal physiological range, it doesn't really matter all that much what your testosterone levels are. But once you get above that range, crazy stuff starts to happen, right? Then you start, then you get steroid-like results because at that point you're on steroids. So from what I've seen, it's pretty similar with myostatin, that if you have normal myostatin levels, your myostatin levels don't really matter all that much. But if you have exceptionally low myostatin levels, then you get super jacked. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of research in humans because I want to say there are only like 2 or 3 reported cases of people who have like the nonsense version of the myostatin allele who like don't produce any myostatin at all. And I think only one of those people is like public. So he was like a kid and his parents took him in for testing and then like let like a news station do like a story on him. The other 2 have been like published as case studies, but I don't know any more information about them. They're not like public people. But yeah, so we don't have much data in humans in terms of what we've seen in mice, for example. Some crazy stuff starts happening in myostatin knockout, like mice or bulls or dogs. Essentially, so for people listening that don't know what myostatin is, it's a protein that essentially functions to limit muscle growth. And if you don't have myostatin, muscles get super big, super quick. But probably the kind of like functional reason for having myostatin is myostatin knockout animals are actually like slow and weak. So not like slow and weak slow in an absolute sense, but not weak in an absolute sense, but relative to how much muscle they have, their muscles are pretty weak. So I want to say like myostatin knockout mice have something like 2.5 times more muscle mass than like a normal mice or a normal mouse would. But they're only like 40% stronger. So like the strength per unit of cross-sectional area of those muscles is dramatically lower than normal mouse muscle. So that seems to be kind of the function of myostatin. It basically constrains rate of muscle growth to make sure the muscles still function properly. And without myostatin, you take the brakes off the growth response, but then the muscles can get so big so quick that kind of the intracellular organization goes to hell and the muscles don't work that well anymore.
Excellent. Yeah, because a lot of people, when they see these Belgian blue cows on TV, they think they're injected with anabolic steroids or other hormones, but it's actually the myostatin deficiency that's causing them to have so much muscle mass. So
something to keep in mind, and I don't think people think about this. So I know that like a few years ago, people were trying to develop myostatin inhibitors, like for bodybuilders. You don't want to be on one of those. Because another thing myostatin does, which is kind of important, is make sure your heart doesn't hypertrophy too much. And if the walls of your heart get too jacked, they can't pump blood effectively anymore. Like some degree of cardiac hypertrophy is totally normal and expected when people take up any sort of physical training. Slightly different with endurance versus strength versus like high intensity cardio adaptations, but whatever. Like it's you're going to have some degree of cardiac hypertrophy. That's perfectly normal, and it's a good functional adaptation. But if the muscle hypertrophies too much, it just can't pump blood effectively, and so that's probably also one of the reasons myostatin's a thing as well. Just make sure your heart keeps working properly. So from what I understand, the myostatin inhibitors they were working on never ended up actually being all that effective, so they never made it to market. If they do make it to market, and this is something that interests you and you think that you might want to take a myostatin inhibitor, give it 5 years and see if people start dying before you jump on that train. Because I have a hunch that you would probably see some cases of heart failure just from excessive cardiac hypertrophy.
Yeah, excellent advice. I think actually Professor Willoughby, that I've had on the show twice, did a study on that a couple of years ago. He was looking at the effect of a myostatin inhibitor, and they basically showed that they don't do anything. So save your money instead.
Like what I said, if you have myostatin within the normal physiological ranges, which are pretty big, it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. So the myostatin inhibitor would need to be effective enough to decrease either production of myostatin or function of myostatin to like sub-physiological levels, and we're just not there yet.
Yeah.
So if it knocks you from like the middle of the range to the low end of the range, you wouldn't expect it to do anything.
All right, Greg, to wrap this podcast up, could you give the listeners take-home message on the topic that we've talked about?
Yeah, for sure. So people have different genes. People have different responses to training. It's not fair, but the universe isn't fair, so it is what it is. Like, you just have to deal with it. But there is still a lot that's within your control. Your genes, if there's a line of total training responses a human can have, and like here is the worst, actually from your perspective, here is the worst possible response you could possibly have. Here's the best possible response you possibly could have of any human ever. Your genes will kind of tell you where in that range you're going to fall. But your work and effort still determines where you're going to fall within that range. So at the end of the day, it is not within your control to get any result you could possibly want to get and to be the best at any sport that you would want to be good at. But it is within your control to determine how close to your own potential you can get. And at the end of the day, that's all there is. So you can love it, you can hate it, but you're going to be happier once you accept it.
Excellent, Greg. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast. It was a pleasure as always. Could you give us some information where people can find more information about you? I know that you recently changed the name of the company that you run, and you also recently launched a really good resource for people in the industry. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on Facebook, Greg Nuckols. I'm on other social media, but that's the only one that matters. Instagram is for dog pics primarily. My website is strongerbyscience.com. It used to be stringtheory.com, which was a pun, but no one got the pun. So I had to change it because that was just grating at my soul. So strongerbyscience.com. And yeah, I recently launched a research review called MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, with Eric Helms and Mike Zordos. And essentially what we're doing for that is we wanted to make a product for people who were interested in strength sports and physique sports, who want to keep up with the research, but either don't have the time to go through all of the journals every month by themselves, which is completely understandable. Like, I'm in the middle of that process for this month right now, and that like consistently takes me like 10 to 15 hours. Like, there's so many journals. So yeah, people who either don't have the time to do that for themselves, or just don't have like the background to be able to read and properly interpret a scientific paper by themselves. So it expedites that process for you. We look at the newest research every month that's directly applicable to strength and physique sports. So if you're a powerlifter, if you're a physique athlete, if you coach powerlifters or physique athletes, weightlifters, bodybuilders, strongmen, etc., you're going to open every issue, and like all or the vast majority of the content is going to be very, very relevant to you, because that's the only population we focus on. And so yeah, it's a monthly research review just to help you stay up to date with the latest science, while saving you a lot of time and making sure you get like the proper understanding and interpretation of those studies.
Sounds good. It looks good. It gotten a lot of good feedback. So thank you guys for doing this awesome work. And for people that don't know who Eric Helms and Mike Zordos is as well, I don't know what to say. If you don't know who those guys are, they do. All of you three guys do awesome work, and I know a lot of people appreciate it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing MASS expanding to a bigger audience, and wishing you good luck. It looks really, really good so far. So thanks a lot, Greg, and thanks a lot for agreeing to do this podcast. A pleasure as always. The sun is down here in Norway, so it's about time to go to bed. I don't know what time it is at your end. It's about
3:30 p.m.
Yeah, okay.
It's still the afternoon. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost almost 10 o'clock here. So time to hit the sack and get some quality sleep. Got a big leg day tomorrow, so.
All right, dude. Good luck.
Okay. Thank you so much, Greg, and have a nice day.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye.